In the previous two videos, we've looked at how to create code projects and code plugins. One detail that I've just briefly glanced over were the files that were generated by the launcher and by the plugin wizard. Before we dive into the code, let's take a closer look at how those files are structured. Unreal Engine and all the projects and plugins are written in C++. In C++ projects, you will typically find .h and .cpp files. The .h files, also called header files, typically contain your declarations of functions and types, and the CPP files contain the implementation of those types and functions. Occasionally, you will also find some files that end in INL. Those are inline header files. They're just included as inline implementations and headers, but they're pretty rare. All the code files that you write for your projects or plugins, they have to be located inside a module. And a module is really just a folder on your disk, along with a C# file, the build.cs file that describes how that module is to be compiled. When you compile your project or your plugin, UBT will compile all modules into libraries, and depending on whether you make a monolithic or non-monolithic build, those libraries will either be static libraries or dynamic libraries. Let's take a look at some of the modules that were created and that are present in the engine. If we dig down into our project, my project, we will see underneath the source folder that there's another folder also called my project. And that's because by default, the Unreal Engine launcher creates a single module for you that has the same name as the project itself. So in this case, also my project. And you see there are already a bunch of header files in here and some CPP files. And there's also the build.cs that describes how this module is to be compiled. We'll look at that later. And you can find the same structure also in the code plugin that we created. Here's our plugin under our projects plugins folder. It's called My First Plugin. And if we dig in there, you'll see there's also a source directory. And again, the source directory contains a single module by default that has the same name as the plugin, My First Plugin. Now, all the code that you write in modules, it can be split into two different groups. There's code that is internal to the module. Those are like the secrets of your module implementation. And then some modules may also export some of their functionality to other modules. So your module can be used elsewhere. Not all modules provide public interfaces, but some do. The private implementation files, they usually go into a subdirectory called private. You can see here for our plugin, there's just the default plugin implementation file. And all the code that should be visible to other modules is usually put underneath the public directory. And you see right now there's just a single header file that contains the class for our public module, for our plugin module. Occasionally you will find some modules that also have a folder called classes. You don't have to worry about that. That's just legacy. We don't really do that anymore. We just haven't cleaned up all the code. So really all the header and CPP files that you will ever write, they should either go into public or private, depending on whether or not other modules need to see them. And you notice that the structure of these modules is always kind of the same. They're always header and CPP files. There's also the build.cs file. Here's the one for our plugin. Here's the one for our project. And you'll see that the same structure is also present in all the modules that are part of the engine. Now, previous versions of Unreal, Unreal Engine 3 and Unreal Engine 2, for example, they had a very small number of modules. There were, I think, less than a dozen, maybe 10 or so, that contained all the functionality. For example, there was a single module that contained all the functionality of the editor, and then another module represented everything that was part of the engine. And of course, that was really hard to maintain. The code inside these few modules was very intertwined. We call that spaghetti code. You couldn't really, it was really difficult to reuse different parts of the engine. If you wanted to get something done, you basically had to dig into the engine code itself and make modifications there. Of course, that's not a good thing, because as you go from project to project, you'll have to bring over all your engine modifications into the new project. It's an awful workflow. So for UE4, we have rewritten and restructured the entire engine code base, and instead of having just a few modules, there are now very many modules, in fact hundreds of them. And you can find those underneath the engine folder in your Visual Studio Solution. And if you dig down, again, there's a source folder, and this is where you will find all the modules that are part of Unreal Engine 4. If you dig into any of these subfolders, you will see lots and lots of stuff in here. Lots of runtime modules and so on. So this makes it much easier to reuse the functionality that's already there without having to touch existing engine code. Everything is much more fine-grained, and as you work on your project, it's more like picking the right pieces that you need and then writing some code around them to glue them together. All right, let's close this real quick. Now, because we have so many modules in the engine, we decided to organize them. And we decided to organize them in a way that indicates how these modules are intended to be used. For example, we have a lot of modules that are only meant to be used in the editor, so naturally those would go into the editor subfolder. There are some other subfolders in here. I prepared a small overview that shows what goes where. You see at the top there is the development directory. Those, or the developer folder, those are all modules that are intended to be used only during development. Those might be debugging tools or just tools that your content creators use to make your game. Those are modules that you won't ever be shipping to your end users, however. The editor subfolder I already mentioned, that's where all the editor stuff goes, and runtime is kind of like a mixed bag of modules that can be used anywhere, whether it is your game, the editor, or some standalone application. The runtime folder contains mostly core functionality that you pretty much always need. And then there's also a third-party folder which contains all the modules with code that we didn't actually write at Epic Games. Our engine also uses a lot of libraries that were written by other companies or other people, so we're trying to reuse as much as possible so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So like I said, initially when you create a new code project or a new code plugin, one module will be created for you, but there's really no limitation as to how many modules you can have in your plugin or in your project. And we do in fact recommend that, if possible, you try to break out your code base into multiple modules and also organize them in a way that indicates their usage. So if your plugin, for example, has some functionality that's only meant to be used in the editor, then put those into editor-specific modules. Otherwise, you might want to put that code into runtime modules. All right, so that's it. To sum it up, there are a lot of modules in Unreal Engine 4. Like I said, there are hundreds. I think we have over 250 now. Don't be discouraged. You don't have to know all this code in order to be effective in UE4. You just have to know how to find things. We do organize all these modules by their intended usage, and each of the modules, they have pretty much the same structure: a public, a private directory, and a build.cs file that configures the compiler. And one thing that I'm often being asked is, Max, if I write a plugin, like where do I find the plugin API that I can program against? And it's important that you understand that in UE4, we don't actually have a specific plugin API. You can use any of the modules that are already part of the code base, so pretty much the entire surface of all the public include files that are present are part of our plugin API. There is no specific subset of code that you program against. All right, in our next video, we're going to look at an actual plugin implementation.